Joining me now, a range of guests on this. I'm joined by Sudhanshu Kaushik, who's Executive Director of the North American Association of Indian Students. He's also an MBA student. I'm also joined by Hemant Bharat Chakrabarti, who's a student at Harvard. He's an AB candidate in Applied Math and Economics. I'm also joined by Vipin Narang, Associate Professor of Political Science at MIT, and joined by Tejas Shah, who's a member of the South Asian Bar Association who focuses on US immigration locations. So today it has to go to the students first. So Sudhanshu and Hemant, Sudhanshu, first has this decision taken you by surprise, and what does it actually mean practically for the thousands of Indian students currently in the US?
I wouldn't say surprised. I mean, we've seen this happening and taking place where in intermediate effects, students have been being targeted, or at least immigrant students have been targeted by the Trump administration. Just last week, I was on NDTV talking about how, students would be the next step, specifically Indian students as well, just basically by the sheer size of them, and other people were saying that, students won't be affected. And here we are today discussing how some people might just be deported if they aren't able to find a way out. In terms of the sheer size, the United States government states that there are over 250,000 Indian students studying on a J1, M1, F1 visa at any given year. You can take as many percentages as you want away from that and try to see how many people actually stay here. And yet, there's such a substantial amount that will be affected. And we're getting calls over thousands of social media outreaches, emails, calls to NAIS. And it's hysteria. People just don't understand what needs to happen. Are they affected or are they not? So while we're, talking about the issue, the fact is that even within the source of all this, and the more that I look at the document, the more confused I get about who and who isn't affected.
Exactly. And I want to bring in Hemant Bharat Chakrabarti here because, Hemant, we know that Harvard announced yesterday that this entire academic year will be online. They, of course, decided to stick to their tuition fees, which is another controversial decision. But for Indian students who've just graduated, who've got offer letters, what does this actually mean? And for a student like yourself who's there currently, does this mean, do you fall into this? Are you also going through that document thinking, what do I actually do now?
Yeah, it's quite an anxious and confusing time because for students who just got admitted, given that Harvard has announced that even for the students who it invites back to its campus, all instruction is going to be online, it looks like the international students who are first-year students just won't be joining the rest of their classmates while the class begins. For students like me who are already here, it takes away a lot of flexibility that institutions like Harvard have tried to offer to us. We're really facing a variety of complex concerns around things like finances, around travel restrictions caused by the pandemic, travel concerns over going back to homes where there is outbreaks in places like Brazil, for instance, or even students who have unsuitable learning environments at home. In a time when our universities are really trying to be as case by case and as flexible as possible, this is a really blunt move that takes away the flexibility from so many students like me. And therefore, it's a very uncertain time for us and very anxiety-inducing as a result.
I'd like to bring in Vipin Narang here, Associate Professor of Political Science at MIT, because Mr. Narang, is this all about the politics eventually? As we heard Sudhanshu say that first was the H-1B visas, now it's about student visas. And Joe Biden said recently that I'll reverse it. I'll make sure H-1B visas are back if I'm elected as president. What's the politics of all this currently that's happening?
Hi, Sonia. Thanks for having me. Normally, I would be here talking to Vishnu about India, China, and the LAC, but my day job is as a professor.
Yes.
And first, I want to express my empathy for the students who have to deal with this anxiety. It's a very perplexing decision because for a long time, immigration has focused on these online scam universities as a pathway to an F1, and there was a rationale for having this provision in their policies. But in a time of COVID, to apply it to students who are already here who might be coming to bricks and mortar universities like Harvard and MIT or UVA and UC Berkeley, the gems of the United States, who provide revenue to the United States and boost the economy in so many of the places where university towns exist, seems kind of perplexing. And I want to say at the outset, I'm not a lawyer. I don't work at an international student's office, so I think there's a lot of clarification that is still pending, both from the administration but also universities who are trying to figure out who this applies to and who it doesn't. This provision was never intended I think, to apply to universities in a pandemic who have to move certain portions of their courses online. And the notion of hybrid courses being exempt, I think, is going to be a focus for how this is applied and what constitutes a hybrid course.
Right.
One thought that occurred to me is that, President Trump, shortly after this decision or shortly before this decision came down, had tweeted about keeping schools open. And I wonder whether this is just a cruel attempt to use university students as a pawn to force universities to have in-person instruction. And so we don't know what the administration's intent is. I mean, we know that the administration has very strong anti-immigrant and xenophobic tendencies, but the universities are very powerful. So I suspect there will be clarifications today and in the coming days. Because it was never intended to apply to the universities the students who are here already.
And so far, I think universities also seem to have been caught off guard because initial statements say we're just actually going through this ourselves. I think the timing also, that tough announcement, literally saying that, pack up, leave or else. I want to bring in Tejas Shah on that because really, legally, is this something? I mean, these are students who've paid their fees. It's not that they've come in on some kind of illegal visas. They're there under all immigration laws to actually just change it around within 24 hours. How is this actually going to work legally now?
Well, great question. I want to start by also expressing my empathy for students who are being impacted by this because God knows that they're dealing with a lot right now in addition to this issue. But from a legal standpoint, the way this was described yesterday is that this would apply to the fall. And again, as background here, viewers should know that since March of this year, universities have had exemptions where they've been able to operate online exclusively, and international students have been able to maintain, their F1 status, even if they were operating in an exclusively online environment. So I share some of the concern about the perplexing nature of this decision. It's really unclear why, if this approach worked for the first half of the year, why all of a sudden it wouldn't work in the second half of the year. From a legal standpoint, I think what the administration is trying to say is that, okay, well, now that you've had a few months to sort of cope with this situation, you're going to have to come up with some sort of hybrid model. And I do think that there is some credence to this view that they're trying to push universities into reopening, which is really putting them in a very uncomfortable place of having to almost choose between public health and keeping their diverse international student populations. I will say that ultimately I foresee this sort of playing out in a couple of different ways. The first is that, as more clarification comes out, more universities say, well, we're going to come up with some sort of hybrid model that might work, particularly because the floor on what that hybrid model looks like seems to be quite low. So I do think that everyone should stay tuned for more information. The second possibility is that we could actually have a legal challenge to, this new position that the administration has announced. And I do think the fact that this was an acceptable accommodation for 3 months, from March through where we are right now, would lend some support to the idea that the decision to not allow it anymore doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
No, and
it's something
right.
that
I think what everybody's saying, the point of the confusion at this time is just adding to the confusion. It's an important revenue source, as we know, for the U.S. economy, for U.S. universities. And, well, other countries seeming to also be looking at this in a different way because, in fact, UK and India tweeted today, and I don't think it's coincidental, that, by the way, if you study in the United Kingdom, you get to stay on 2 years after that as well. So already we know the US, in a sense, for 3 years if you did a PhD and 2 years if you do a normal undergrad study. So we already know that Canada and other countries had come up, and with this latest decision, well, Indian students may just be looking at other places. But I hope this confusion is sorted out soon. Thanks so much, all of you, for joining us this evening on this crucial debate.